I want to talk briefly about the language of prayer. What language should we be praying in? And this might seem a fairly basic kind of question, perhaps one that almost doesn't need asking. I'll speak my language when I pray. But there's a bit more nuance to it than that, that can reveal to us some helpful things about our spiritual church life that I hope can become clear. Firstly, as a general response to the question, in what language should I pray? The language you pray in should be your language. When we're praying liturgically in the church, we're doing something communal. And so the question of language becomes different, because there might be many languages spoken by people in the parish. And so the question there is slightly different. But when we're praying at home, in our prayer corner, when we're praying alone, for example, this is something personal, and it should be in our language that resonates with our hearts, something we understand, something that is part of who we are, because it is precisely who we are and what we are that we are trying to condition and shape and transfigure through the practice of prayer. So we should pray in our language. However, that's not necessarily to say always, it usually is, but it's not always to say that it has to be our maternal language or our spoken language. Let me use myself as an example. I am an English speaker. English is my maternal tongue. I speak other languages as well, but English is my inbuilt language, and a strange mishmash of American and British English. As most of you know, I'm from America and grew up for the most part in the United States, but have lived a long time in the UK and other places, and my voice has always been, since I was very young, just kind of chameleon-like. It's echoing what I hear around me. And so the result is that I speak a mishmash of American English and British English with a mishmash of accents that is just a frustration to me. I wish I could not do that, but that's just how my mind has worked my whole life. But the prayer book I showed you in a previous talk when we were looking at prayer books, my prayer book, this is the one I use on a daily basis. This is a book in Church Slavonic. And this is not because I feel the particular obligation to pray in Slavonic, but because as I was growing in the church, and as I was learning how to pray and learning the prayers, for the most part I learned these in Church Slavonic. And so even though English is my native language, and I love it, it's a beautiful language, very capable of beautifully expressing spiritual things, nevertheless, for a great many prayers, I feel much more comfortable, much more natural praying them in Slavonic, because that's how I first got to know them. And I understand what I'm praying there, and the rhythm of the words on my tongue is familiar to me. It's not absolute. Some parts of my prayer life I learned in the context of the English language. And so in my own prayer, when I'm praying by myself privately, it's a bit of a linguistic a trampoline, kind of going back and forth between various things. One prayer I'm in Slavonic, and then the next one is in English, not as a kind of charted out, do this in this language and that in the next, but this prayer I just happen to know in English. The prayer that Church Slavonic speakers know is Nino Pushayeshe, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace. I always pray that in my own prayer in English, because that's how I first learned it. Tsaryu Nebiesny, O heavenly King, comforter, spirit of truth. I always pray that in Slavonic. That's how I first learned it. So when we say pray in your language, that might mean something different than just the obvious fact of your maternal tongue. However, here's something that I feel very important to emphasize. Prayer should be in an exalted form of our language. That is to say, it's never been the tradition of the Church to pray, to offer up our words to God in the same language that we use for ordinary speech. The emphasis on putting everything in the vernacular is to a point useful, and certainly it is the Orthodox custom from very early on to translate and to preach in the language that people understand as the missionary movement spreads into different areas. But it can easily be taken too far when vernacular means what vernacular literally means, which is the ordinary everyday speech. And if you actually look at the missionary endeavors of the church at various points when she was translating from Greek into Church Slavonic or into Armenian or into Georgian and other things, in none of these cases did she ever translate into the word on the street, into ordinary vernacular speech. She put her texts, the scriptures, the hymns, etc., into the language of the people, but always into an exalted form of it. Because even the words we use have ascetical value. If we constantly use the same manner of speaking that we use around the dinner table, or at work, or on the playground in school, if that's the same speech that we use when we converse about God or with God, we are at an interior level equating these two realms. And the work of prayer is to actually condition the heart towards something more exalted, that ongoing and perpetual communion with God. And so when we do speak to God, about God, with God, when words are necessary, and they are necessary at times, then we deliberately choose a rarefied, exalted form of our language in order to do this. And so the best prayers in English, for example, are prayers that use an exalted form of the language. Must it be precisely King James English? No, of course not. The language of the King James translation of the scriptures, for example, is for most parts very beautiful and exalted. It's sometimes hard to understand because it's rather different from our vernacular speech today, but there's nothing wrong with it being hard to understand. Learn it. It's a different way of speaking. There are some limitations. It's not always accurate. There are some phrases that simply mean something totally different now. So we can't simply say wholesale use that as opposed to anything else. It is possible, I think, much more easily to have translations of prayers and services that are in a vernacular that is just demonstrably too normal, where the language is so base, so pedestrian, that we find ourselves speaking to God in the same speech patterns and the same vocabulary as doing our laundry and having a conversation about school. To me, this is very unhelpful. So I always urge people, when they are getting prayer books and other materials to help them in their prayer, to try to find things that use an exalted manner of expression in your language. And there can be variation within that, of course. Wherever possible, unless circumstances make this untenable, try to find prayer books and other sources of prayer that you might use, not just the prayer book itself, but other things as well, that use the same language that's used in your parish. Because this creates a harmony between how you pray at home, the words and the expressions you use at home, and those that you hear when you're in the temple and praying there. So to the question, in what language should I pray? I suppose maybe the rounded out answer should be, in the language of my heart as that is shaped by an exalted approach to the glory of God. Let us learn from good liturgical language how to speak in a more exalted manner, so that the language within us, our own speech, starts to become more elevated when we talk to God. Now, does that mean that when I stand without a prayer book in front of my icons, and I choose to speak my own phrases, my own thoughts, my own words to God, that I need to be translating these into King James style or Coverdale style language? Do I need to say to God, I pray thee that thou art with me whithersoever I shall go this afternoon, as opposed to saying, God, I pray that you will be with me today as I travel? No, you don't need to make a project of trying to sound archaic in your own speech. But as I hope is clear from the whole thrust of these talks over the past weeks, The more we expose ourselves to exalted language, the more our own language starts, when we think of God and talk to God, starts to become exalted. We will probably never, and there's no reason why we should ever, sound like the King James translators when we say our own private prayers. But we should reach a point, and we can reach a point by being exposed to more exalted language, by letting that sink in to our prayers as we read them from the sacred books and so on. We can reach a point where when we choose to talk to God in our own tongue, in our own voice, that voice is itself different than the voice in which we speak to our co-workers or to others about mundane things. That in our own way, through that exposure, we start to develop that same veneration, that same nobility of speech from our lips and in our hearts when we talk to God. That's probably enough on that. And indeed, this probably wraps up our little series on the practices of prayer. I'm sure we'll talk more about these things as time goes on. But it has been my hope in these last few sessions to share what I pray might be fruitful bits of counsel from the practices of the Church to help everyone in our own lives of prayer. But I want to finish the way I started, which is to say that in all of these things, I have expressed what I hope are standard counsels from our practice as Orthodox Christians that can apply in almost any kind of context: family life, single life, new convert life, cradle for many decades life, and everything in between. But please don't make changes to your life of prayer. Don't make any changes to your rule of prayer if you have one. And in general, don't leap out on the task of recrafting your spiritual practices without speaking to your spiritual father, your priest, and having both his blessing and his ongoing guidance, so that what you are doing is indeed what is best for your soul and your attainment of God's kingdom. Amen.